Andre, you there? Can you hear us?
Hi, Brian. Yes,
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So, thanks for joining us, Andre. So, just to give folks a little bit of background. So, Andre, you and I and Adam all know one another through this group of CTOs in San Francisco, which sounds like it just ridiculously clubby. And in fact, it is called CTO Club, which a name that I do not necessarily love. Um, but it's a great group of folks. And Andre, how long? I feel like I've known you for 4 or 5 years to that. I'm not sure how long it's been.
I think it was about maybe 3 years.
3 years ago. Okay. So,
Yeah.
and so I get to this group gets together once a month. And I always actually prefer the sessions where we don't have a guest speaker, where it's just folks talking about things they've learned or challenges that they have. And Andre, I've got, you and I have got a very similar approach on a lot of things. And then but other outside of this kind of group, we haven't spent a huge amount of time together. And then this kind of past meeting, you were, of course, presenting on what's happening in your native Ukraine. And I'm like, oh my God, of course. I just hadn't, I felt like an idiot for having kind of not asked the obvious question. But you are Ukrainian, and this has been, it's been heartbreaking for everyone, but must just be absolutely gutting and obviously with many, many connections. So thank you, first of all, for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. And I wondered if we could just start from the beginning a little bit and talk about how you grew up and how you discovered computers, how you got into technology. And maybe we can take it from there.
Well, Brian, first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me and sort of giving me an opportunity to talk in front of this group. And I see there's a lot of people joining. So this is pretty cool to be able to talk more about Ukraine and what is going on in Ukraine. In terms of so let me share some of my background here. I was born in Ukraine. I was there for the first 18 years of my life. When I was 18, I packed up and I moved to New York. And in New York, I completed my education in Brooklyn College, which is City University of New York, on computer science. And sort of that started my career in computers. Or rather computer software, I should say. I'm talking to a lot of I need to reground myself because I'm talking to a lot of people who are not software engineers. And I'm just in general, I'm saying I'm in computers, and that sort of covers it. So the way that I got into software engineering is when I forgot, I wasn't it's like high school. I went to my mom's office and I saw a computer that was like I think it was like an XT or AT286 at that point. And
And so, Andre, if I could just ask for
yeah.
context, so what year are we talking about here? Because I've always, you and I are think of the similar vintage, but I actually don't know that for a fact.
Okay, let me see. That's a good question. So
I mean, it's
92, I want to say.
92. Okay, so this is just, and 89 is obviously wall comes down and Warsaw Pact collapses. When does Ukraine gets its independence in 89? With my apologies for the ignorance. Or 90, I guess.
So I'm gonna be similarly as ignorant when I'm looking.
This makes me feel better.
Looking back at my life, the year, it's impossible for me to remember all the years, but this is roughly the time frame. Yes, when Soviet Union collapsed, and then.
And Andre, when that happened, did the kinds of technology that you then saw change significantly, or were you kind of, is it hard to distinguish that from just like becoming more aware as like a teenager and young adult?
So at that point, I think I was still too young to sort of recognize that. I was in school, so it's an equivalent of middle school, I guess. At that point, um, it's as kids, I don't think we are recognizing things for what they are. Truly, we just we see our parents, we may see some struggle, but it's just normal life for us. And we're taking it as is. We don't know any difference. We don't know anything different. Um, so at that point, I was too young. Now, I think once it collapsed, we started to see a little bit more of a technology entering sort of former Soviet Union. One of the landmark things that happened that I remember very clearly is we started to get the videotape players. And that was a huge deal. All of a sudden, we could have one of those, in an apartment with a TV. We just only had TVs, right? And all
Right.
of a sudden, we could have this videotape player and actually watch, Hollywood movies. That was amazing. Prior to that, they were like super expensive. And what people would do is it's like movie theaters. People would go somewhere where there would be a TV with the sort of the video player, and they would get 15 people in the room, and we would watch like a smaller TV, I guess. Playing some sort of a movie, ridiculously translated, just ridiculously, and that would be a lot of fun. But then at some point, we were able to sort of more of those video players were getting in. I guess for me at that point, that was more impactful or interesting.
Right, exactly. You're a teenager, so this is like, yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And like, again, like, I'm not sure the exact years, but like Schwarzenegger was like Commando movie, Commando, whatever it is. Some of those like legendary movies, Rocky, were hidden in, and they were incredible. So I guess back to the computers.
Yeah. Back to high school. Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm going to the office, and I don't remember whether it was IBM XT or whether it was IBM AT 286. Definitely nothing beyond that. It's 286 at most. I don't know if everyone on this call or in this space recognizing what XT and AT 286 is. But
if they hang out with us, they've been inflicted. I feel like these poor millennials that have heard nothing but about these antiquarian PCs. So don't worry.
Yeah, you're among friends. Yeah,
we're among friends.
Okay, I guess this is a safe space.
That's right.
Yeah. So I saw one of those like for the first time, and I'm like, the thing that got my attention, it was off, right? And the thing that got my attention is that the monitor, and it was one of those, the super old tube, not flat, it was just like, I'm not even sure how to describe it, but like huge monitor. The color of the tube was different than the color of the tube on the TV that I had at home. It was a little more grayish. And for whatever reason, that fact stuck in my imagination. So I turned it on. I sort of played with it. I knew nothing about it. And what I saw was Microsoft DOS, and there was like Norton Commander running on it. So that's another antique thing that some of us would remember.
I need like a lighter emoji. Isn't there a lighter emoji here that I can like? Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. And Norton Commander, guys, is for those of you who don't know, it's like two panels on the screen, and it's not a graphic screen. It's sort of rendered using characters. And on the left and on the right, two panels, they're the same, and it's like a file system. And you could browse the file system on the left, and you can browse the file system on the right, and then you could copy stuff back and forth between left and right panels. That's what it was. So the whole thing, I got so interested in what it is. So the next day, I went to a bookstore, and I bought a book on Norton Commander. And then within the next few days, I just, without having the computer, without access to it, it was in my mom's office, right? I just read the book end to end, and I learned everything I could about Norton Commander. And then I asked my mom if I can come in and actually play with it. And this was the moment that my career started, essentially. That I got in love with computers, with software. And it all started with the fact that the color of that monitor screen, when it was turned off, was different from the color of the tube on the TV. That's how the whole
awesome.
thing started.
Such a familiar story. I feel like all of these stories rhyme with one another, right? In terms of like that, I feel that so many of us discovered computing that same way. And where did you grow up? Where did you live in Ukraine?
So I was born, and for the entire 18 years, I lived in a city that used to be called Dnipropetrovsk. It's Dnipro now, a lot shorter, a lot easier to pronounce. It's actually in the middle of the country, literally. And Ukraine has this interesting property, I guess, about it, is that Ukraine historically speaks two languages. One of the languages is Russian, another language is Ukrainian. So as you follow along the river Dnipro, and Dnipro, the city, is sort of in the middle, historically, starting with Kiev, going into Dnipro, and down into to the south to Odessa, that was the line between sort of eastern and western Ukraine. And eastern Ukraine was Russian speaking, including where I am from. And then western Ukraine was Ukrainian speaking. And actually, the closer you got to like other countries like Poland, the language sort of the more and more Polish-like it sort of became. And historically, also the western part of Ukraine was under very, very different rule of different countries. So there's a lot of history with Austrians, Germans, Polish, and actually other folks. So if you guys have an opportunity to go to Lviv, you could, and this is one of the bigger cities in the west of the country. It has a lot of that history, which is like sort of really intermixed together, and that makes a very unique city and interesting to see city in Ukraine. So anyway, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel that like obviously I think like all of us, or like many of us, I should say, been learning a lot about the geography of Ukraine and just its size and borders and complexity. And so Dnipro, and this is spelled Dnipro.
Yes,
is
correct.
That right?
Yes.
Okay, right. Okay. So and so this is on the border of this is like right at the confluence of these two cultures. It sounds like
that's right. Yes.
And do people grow up speaking both Russian and Ukrainian, or what was it like? I mean, what's the language that you learned in classes, for example, or what did you speak at home?
So that was interesting because I grew up speaking Russian, and I can understand, and I would understand Ukrainian. I would not speak Ukrainian on a day-to-day basis. So, if you ask me what I speak at home, I speak Russian. What language I speak at home. Now, at some point, when I think that was the last year, or whatever, a couple of last years that I was in Ukraine. So that was, let me calculate it in my mind. 82, 90, 92. This was the point where the entire educational system in Ukraine was forcefully shifted to use Ukrainian language.
Interesting.
And we said that, hey, we're Ukraine, and the sort of the, how do you say it, like government official language, whatever the official language of the country is Ukrainian, and everyone has to like learn and speak Ukrainian. And if you go to school, if you go to university, you will be taught in Ukrainian. That was a nightmare for me. Like I was learning math in the university, the first course in university that I started in Ukraine, and all of a sudden one day the teacher's coming in, and she's starting to speak Ukrainian, and I'm like, holy shit! Like I don't know those math terms.
Oh man. God, we thought distance learning was hard. I think I'm going to give my kids some perspective on like, hey, at least distance learning is happening in the same language.
Yeah.
And so Ukrainian was really just sort of your domestic language. Like, how do you navigate around the kitchen, but not to do complex, or technical or mathematical things?
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like Andre speaking Russian. Were you speaking Russian at home or Ukrainian?
I'm speaking Russian, so for my whole life,
yeah, right.
I'm speaking Russian at home.
Right. Got it.
Yeah, but they shifted the educational system, this whole learning experience into Ukrainian. But they did it a little too late for me. So at that point, I pretty much left. Very soon after they did that, I came to New York.
Got it. Okay. And so then did you come so you're an 18-year-old, and did you have family in New York, or how did you get from Dnipro to Brooklyn?
Yeah, I had a few relatives. I had my grandma here and my uncle. So I went to New York to sort of continue to study. Now, my parents just approached me and they said, "Hey, Andre, do you wanna go to New York?" And when you are 18, like you don't even think about those things. I'm like, New York sounds interesting. Sure. That was it.
Right, exactly. Right.
That was the entire logic that I had to like answer that question. And it was when I came to New York, it was very interesting. Like I knew English, I could write and read in English, but I never had opportunity to speak or interact with people in English.
Right, and unfortunately, they don't speak English in New York.
Well, there's a fair Brooklyn accent in there. Yes, so it took me a while actually to I could express what I wanted, but it was hard for me to understand what people were telling me, and I would ask them to hey, slow down a little bit, and it took me about a year to start to fully be fluid and understand the language well.
And did it feel like exciting, or did it feel like you'd been displaced? I mean, how did it feel? Did it feel like this is an exciting next step, or did you miss home actually?
I missed home, yes. I went to, as I said, Brooklyn College. Brooklyn College was a pretty good computer science school back then. Actually, I'm not sure what's going on now. I would imagine it's still pretty good at computer science. I did not understand the culture. The culture was pretty foreign to me, and that was different times. It's like nowadays people are flying all over the world, meeting people of different cultures and so forth. At that point, my flight to New York was my first flight ever on an airplane.
Right.
And I was 18, and I had the only culture I knew is by watching Hollywood movies. So it was interesting. I would go into a pizzeria, right, a pizza place, and I'm like, okay, how do I order pizza? And I would look at what people in front of me in the line, how they would ask for a pizza, and I would copy them. And this is how I would order pizza.
Yeah. Did you get some interesting pizzas that way? You're just like, all right, whatever the hell this is, I guess I'm eating anchovies now. Whatever this is.
Yeah, whatever they have, please. Yeah, I'm kind of kidding about it, but I'm kind of not kidding. It was sort of like a very interesting discovery for me, and a lot of learning of new culture, new language. Like all of a sudden, I'm in a completely different world, very, very different.
And are you thinking at this point, I'm going to be here for a while, and then I'm going to return to Ukraine? I mean, was that your thinking, or what were you?
That was always an open question whether I would stay here or not stay here. But then that question kind of went away over time. And I sort of decided to stay and sort of close that out. But for like maybe 5 to 7, 8 years, maybe, I still had this question in my mind on whether I want to come back or whether I want to stay here.
And of course, at that time, we are folks of our vintage. I mean, born lucky in terms of the timing, because the internet is exploding, and there's so much growth and prosperity effectively happening in tech. I mean, that must have made it easier to a certain degree to have so much opportunity in front of you.
I absolutely agree. I'm not sure if I thought that way back then. Again, I was a kid. I was a kid in a brand new environment, and I was just going with the flow to a degree, without like right now I'm thinking about my career in a very specific way, like what do I want to achieve, where do I want to go next, what's going on in the world, what's going to be cool, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. Back then it was like, oh, I like writing programs. Like I like software. I like to write it. What is it that I can do? What is it that I can write? And I pretty much started to work very, very quickly. First, as I was in school full time, I started to work part time, but then I very quickly reversed it, right? I worked full time and school was part time. I was just writing software and I was so happy doing it. Not much mattered beyond that, honestly. I just wanted to write more cool software.
That's such a great time of life, I think. So, and then family is still back in Ukraine at this point. You kind of go through this period of like, maybe I'll go back, maybe I won't. And then I guess, one question I definitely have is like, fast forwarding to 2014 in terms of and if that's too much of a leap, let me know. But did you still have family in Ukraine? And that must have been obviously your first hint that Ukraine was really vulnerable. Maybe that was not a surprise to you at all.
So yes, that was so. I still have my family is still there. So my parents are still there. My wife's parents are still there. And they were there. And 2014 was very tough. So what we used to do is like every summer we would take our kids to their grandparents, to Dnipro, and they would spend the entire summer with their grandparents. And by the way, this is how they learned Russian very well, is by spending summers in there. And they were forced, like the grandparents would not understand English. They go to the store, people would not understand English. Like they had to be fluent in the language, and they actually speak very well. A lot of people are surprised when they hear that our kids were born here, but so my son is youngest. He has a little bit of an accent. My daughter is pretty much no accent in how she speaks, and they're both very, very fluent. All of that is because we were sending them back to Ukraine to spend summers. Now, that was the first summer that we did not send them to Ukraine.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Dodged the bullet. Wow.
Yeah. So, it was scary. It was not not clear what was happening at all. But thankfully, at that point, it was just just part of the country got involved, not the entire country, into what was happening, right?
Right. And did you have? Because I mean, we at the time, I don't know, Adam, if you did, but we had a Ukrainian team in 2014, and we were engaged with a contractor who had a Ukrainian team. We did not directly, and I mean, they were almost apologetic, like, oh, we may not be able to work tomorrow because of the war. And it's like, you should don't worry about work.
Take the day off, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I didn't what's going on with the war? I mean, I just felt like it was so distant, but then you begin to realize that, like, wow, this is the war in the Crimea was very close to home for a lot of these folks. Did you have people in tech that you were working with in Ukraine at the time?
Yeah, so 2014, I already started my first company. So that was SmartLing. It's a translation localization management platform. And we had a team. We had a fairly large team in Ukraine, in Dnipro. I think right around that time, we also opened a second office in Kiev. But yeah, we had like 2/3 of my team was in Ukraine. So,
wow.
So what we've done at that point, and this is another thing that I remember very clearly, is we were doing planning on how to evacuate the team. We actually had buses on standby, sort of ready to pick up people and take them to Western Ukraine. And there was a lot of uncertainty around that time into what was happening. So Crimea was taken without pretty much a single shot. So what you could say is that Ukraine was not ready to defend its land at all.
Huh.
And Russia had its own military bases in Crimea for the Black Sea, sort of around all of their Black Sea forces, Navy forces, and they pretty much, like, within, I think, couple of days, took the entire Crimea over, and that was it. And they and they stopped there, right? So there was some there was some fights around Mariupol, but they did not go. So Mariupol is very close to this to like when you cross Crimea into the sort of the mainland. Mariupol is sort of right there. And so this was one of the contested cities, but Russia did not go that far back then. And then the Crimea is part of the issue, right? So it was never accepted as part of Russia. I don't think any countries, or maybe just a few countries, sort of accepted as being part of Russia, but it's still considered to be Ukraine territory. So it's going to be interesting what's going to happen with this war. So when we're going to fast forward into what is happening now, I think there is a political will to get all Ukraine territories back.
Yeah, so speak to that a little bit, because so in 2014, you said that there wasn't the willpower, or there wasn't maybe the readiness, or maybe it was so shocking. Clearly, there is that willpower now. What in 2014, did people think to themselves, they're going to come, this advance is going to continue and we need to kind of mentally prepare? Or how has that change happened?
Right. So back then, I don't think Ukraine had its own, it kind of had and it kind of did not have its own identity. And it definitely did not have its army. It sort of had the army, but it was not equipped. It wasn't in any way, shape, or form to actually fight. And I think a lot of that happened since 2014. So by the way, Crimea was not the only problem in Ukraine that Russia introduced, right? So there is they sort of separated two different republics on the east of the country. So if you guys have a map in front of you, if you looked at the eastern part, there's Luhansk and what's the other one? It's like and Donetsk. So all that area sort of was separated. Let's see what Google shows.
And this is not that. I mean, Dnipro is effectively on the border of one of those regions, right?
Yes, Dnipro is on the border of those regions. Exactly.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. So essentially, like two cities, Lugansk and Donetsk, they were sort of they were kind of separated, announced that they're their own republics, all sponsored by Russia, obviously. And they would put puppet government in there, and ever since, so Crimea and those two regions were like, Crimea is part of Russia, and there's two different regions. They're like Palestine and Israel, essentially. This is what Russia did with them. Very militarized, with a ton of propaganda in there. Most people who were in there, who were people who were thinking about stuff, right? They left. They went into other cities. A lot of them went to Kiev, but they sort of were sitting there as sort of two different republics. So that was 2014. That was the
2014. And so, I mean, you obviously got you're looking after your team, and you're obviously looking after your own kids and not going to send them to the summer to their grandparents because you're concerned about their safety. Mm-hmm. How are you feeling at that time in terms of, I mean, did you have any ambivalence, or were you just like, this is what was your feeling at the time about all of this? It's very destabilizing, clearly.
It was, it was very scary, for sure. But it was different from what's happening now. Back then, it was sort of more localized. Right. I wasn't sure that it would not expand beyond those regions. And there was, Crimea was sort of, we just gave up on it. The government just gave up on it. There was no way we could do anything in there. Now, those two regions on the east, we were fighting, but Russia was not ready to enter as Russia, right? They pretended that it was not them. They pretended that it's like local farmers are raising up and they don't want to be part of Ukraine. So there was a lot of that, right? Russia was not committing their full sort of military might into this. They were semi-pretending that it's not them.
And, you obviously grew up Russian-speaking in Dnipro. Your parents are clearly Russian-speaking. I think it sounds like part of Russia's calculation was, this Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine identifies themselves more as Russians than as Ukrainians. But, you're using the first person plural when you talk about Ukraine. So you clearly identified as Ukrainian during this. I mean, it sounds like it was kind of the beginning of a Russian miscalculation with respect to Is that a correct inference?
I think, I think Ukraine society, Ukraine as a country, Ukraine as its Ukrainian people was really formed after 2014. I think I would credit Putin with
Hmm.
forming Ukraine as
Hmm.
Ukraine, with
Interesting.
its own identity. Because, like, keep in mind, for whatever 70 something years under Soviet Union, Ukraine was just a part of Soviet Union, right? It was that you did not have it. It kind of had a little bit of its identity, but very, very little. Ukrainian
Yeah.
as a language was discouraged. You sort of had to speak Russian. Russian was the language to speak everywhere, the government language and so forth. Um, so people lost the identity, and then it was sort of in flux after the Soviet Union broke out, right? And then after 2014, this is when it really gelled, this identity for Ukrainians.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I really wondered about that because and from your personal perspective, you must have been like, I mean, obviously, Dnipro is home. I'm sending my kids there. It's important to me that my kids speak to my parents, or that they speak Russian. But like, I mean, you must have been like, I don't know, like Ukrainian was also like the thing I like screwed up my junior year in trigonometry or whatever, calculus.
Mm-hmm.
You must have had some kind of ambivalence, but then that ambivalence is kind of sandblasted off by this catalyzing event where it's like, oh, okay, that's who we are.
That's exactly right. It's like it was annoying for me to switch to Ukrainian. It was like I didn't want to do it. And then in school, right? But after 2014, this is how like everyone went like, holy shit, we're Ukrainians.
Yeah, interesting. Wow.
And I'm sure for some people it was earlier, for some people it was later, whatever. But it really galvanized everyone sort of into this Ukrainian identity.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so then because I think that then the period from kind of 2014 to 2022, clearly this is a top of mind issue for Ukrainians, but kind of out of mind for the rest of the world. I feel like the rest of the world's like, I don't know, Chechnya kind of settled out. Everyone's kind of turning a blind eye to it. But there's this escalation that is clearly happening. And Ukraine, I mean, this is the reason that Trump is impeached, because he's trying to screw up a weapons deal that the Ukrainians as it turns out, boy, the Ukrainians were really prescient about, like, no, we desperately need these javelins and other anti-tank guided missiles that Trump was trying to connect to political favors, and there's a reason he was impeached. But this must have been very front of mind for Ukrainians, that this is a real danger that is brewing in Russia.
So, what's interesting? It is. I'm going to say that it was not. Right. So I think I think there were a few people. So Ukraine definitely started to build the army. Started to they started to finance the army the right way. I think the level to which Ukrainian army gotten in those 8 years is just remarkable. Like I wasn't aware that all of this was happening, frankly. We sort of, after 2014, it sort of settled down. Everyone got used to new reality. Like, there were still problems on the east of the country. We needed to defend that because it's like Israel and Palestine, right? There were always something is happening. So we needed to make sure that we had a strong army. This is one of the stronger points right now, because we're well armed, and with good presence in that particular direction. But short of that, it sort of kind of was out of sight, out of mind for most Ukrainians. Like, I've been to Ukraine countless times. Like, when you're in Dnipro, when you're in Kiev, like, you don't feel that there are problems on the eastern part of the country at all. People go do their business, a ton of investments, a ton of there's so much construction, build new buildings going on in Kiev, in Dnipro. This is where I spend the most time, but other cities as well. Ukraine is a democracy, for sure. We are electing our own presidents. We do our own revolutions when we don't like those presidents, or when there's too much corruption. Ukraine has a lot of problems with corruption, for sure. It's sort of democracy, sort of an oligarchy, and that's a huge problem, a huge problem in the country. But it's our country, right?
Right.
And we do what people think needs to be done, including revolutions, including electing the presidents that we want to elect, and so forth. It's a free country. To a degree, even sort of was this COVID years, and I have to be careful, understanding that I'm in California and the mindset of most people here. But like when I went to after COVID year, when I went back to Ukraine, it's like, it's complete freedom. Like, you can do whatever the hell that you want to do. Like, no one cares. No one does any mandates or whatever. A lot of businesses grew up. I think the country was all its problems, and there are a lot of problems, as I said, but the country it's a great country. It was one of the most interesting, and I hope still is one of the most interesting destinations for tourism. It was inexpensive, relatively inexpensive, with just amazing restaurants, stores, a lot of history. So it's like it's an amazing European destination. I actually recommended everyone to go and explore Ukraine, because it's just really, really interesting destination for tourists. It's like a gem that people don't know about.
And at this point, how frequently are you going to Ukraine? I mean, because do you still have a team over there, or did you have a team over there?
Yeah, so my entire career, I have teams in Ukraine, and I'm working with Ukrainian engineers. So I would go like 3 to 4 times a year. I would visit my parents. I would go on business, do business stuff, and then go visit my parents. So pretty often.
And often in Dnipro or Kiev as well. I mean, are you?
Yeah, I would. Yeah,
okay, so a lot of it. Yeah,
exactly. I would fly to Kiev. I would spend time in Kiev. Then I would fly to Dnipro, spend time there, go back to Kiev. So those two sort of cities that I would spend the bulk of my time over there.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. And then, then at what point is it beginning to dawn? Because I feel like it was only towards the end of 2021 that this began to pop up, at least on my radar screen, of like, wow, this is some seriously bad news happening on the border. I mean, had there been warning signs long in advance of that?
So Russia started to accumulate their military forces along the entire border, and it's a huge border. There's a lot of border between Ukraine and Russia. Not only they started to accumulate their forces along that border, it's Belarus as well that was overflowing with Russian forces. Now, of course, they've explained. They said, no, we're not going to attack. This is going to be, just whatever the military, what do you call it, like military games, whatever that they're doing, military training exercises, joint military training exercises with like Belarus. And then, so they started to accumulate a lot of armed forces in there. So what happened then is, and I'm sure sort of the politicians would probably realize this sooner than everyone else. We're like, it's 2022 out there. They are not going to attack Ukraine with, a typical World War II style war.
Right.
Ukraine is Europe. And by the way, so let me talk about Ukraine in terms of what it means for a second, because I'm not sure people fully realize what Ukraine is. So Ukraine is part of Europe. It's a European country. It's the largest European country, right? So Russia is not considered to be a European country because it's in Europe and Asia at the same time. Ukraine has 44 million people. Russia has 144 million people. So as I mentioned, Ukraine is a democracy, and it's protecting its right of freedom. Russia is not a democracy. Russia has Putin for like more than 20 years that he is at power. Ukraine is fully aligned to what's called Western values. It wants to be a part of European Union. Some interesting parts of this is Ukraine can meet the food needs of 600 million people. It's first in Europe in terms of, I think it's called like arable land areas. It's like where you can do agriculture. Third place in the world by the area of black soil. Black soil is the best soil to grow stuff. So we're talking about 25% of world's volume of black soil is Ukraine. First place in the world export of sunflower and sunflower oil. Second place in the world for barley production, and fourth place in barley exports. Fourth largest exporter of corn in the world. Fourth largest producer of potatoes in the world. Fifth largest rye producer in the world. Fifth place in the world in bee population. A lot of wheat exports. There is a lot of ore, uranium, titanium. It's like literally like the first in Europe in reserves of uranium. Second place in Europe in terms of the titanium ore. What else is in here? Second largest iron ore reserves in the world. Second place in Europe in terms of mercury, and so on and so on. It's an economic powerhouse from those standpoints. Very powerful industries are built around this, like around titanium, iron, sort of stuff like that. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of sort of why it matters, why markets are very jittery right now. Like, guys, the food is getting more expensive, for sure. There is no way around it. Russia is not selling its food, and Ukraine, especially Ukraine, is not selling its food right now. So all of that is going to get more expensive. Now, the scary stuff, Ukraine has 15 active nuclear reactors located at 4 nuclear power plants spread across the country, right? And plus 4 decommissioned reactors at Chernobyl. So that's the scary part. It's sort of it's a nuclear bomb that cannot be moved, right? But it could still be sort of blown up.
And Andre, I mean, for all of these reasons, I mean, it's a vast country. It's bigger than France. It's got a huge population, as you said, the biggest country in Europe. I mean, it must have been absolutely shocking to you, as it was, I think, to the world, that there was this incredible miscalculation that this country would just kind of roll over, and that's clearly not what has happened. I mean, I assume you were pretty shocked. I mean, at what point did you kind of accept that the invasion was inevitable? Was it earlier than the rest of the world?
So I did not believe that they would invade until probably a couple of days before the invasion. And then a couple of days before the invasion, it dawned at me, they're going to do it. And the reason that it dawned at me is that I started to look at a lot of analytics about sort of Putin's mindset and where he is. So it's one. And two, usually when you're doing sort of military forces training, you are not stocking it up with like fresh blood and like hospitals right along the border, right? You're just doing the training exercises. And they were doing that. So those two things, a couple of days before the invasion, I went, holy shit, they gonna do it.
Wow. And are your parents still in Dnipro at this time?
They're still in Dnipro. They're still in Dnipro right now, yes.
They're in Dnipro now?
Yes.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So.
Oh my God.
So what's interesting is, so I actually left People AI. So People AI was my last company where it was ran engineering, but the CEO of People AI, Oleg, he actually looking at what Biden was doing, and he actually has some connections within the administration. People AI started to act a couple of months prior to invasion. So most folks on People AI team, we actually got out prior to the war. People who agreed to leave the country. While I wasn't like, I didn't believe that they would do it, but Oleg acted, and good for him. So yeah, I did not, and a lot of people did not believe it to like at all until 4 a.m. they've launched the attacks across the entire border, and they bombed all major airports that they knew about with either with planes or with precision missiles. 4 a.m. people woke up to explosions in large cities, explosions around the airports, and they entered the country.
Wow. And I mean, that it must have been, and this is only, how has it been? 3 weeks, 4 weeks? It's not been that long. Whatever it's
19 days.
19 days.
19
oh my
days.
God.
Yes.
And I mean, you must be, it just, especially with, I mean, God, Mariupol, what's been happening. I mean, all of these cities, but it's just clearly the targets are becoming, they are civilian targets, or they're indiscriminate.
So
I mean,
yeah, so it's their strategy and tactics actually changed. So what they were hoping to do, and it's ridiculous. It shows just, so it happens at some companies. There are some parallels to learn from. In some companies, when you look at the leadership, they're very disconnected with what's going on the ground, right? When people report to them what they want to hear. This is what happened with Putin. For a long, long time, people reported to Putin what he wanted to hear. And they sort of continue to report that it's going to be very similar to Crimea, that Ukrainian people are going to meet the tanks with like flowers and welcome them into the country, that they're going to march through the country, get into the Kyiv, topple the government, install their puppet government, and they had like 3 days to do it, and that would be it. And it's a fact. It's confirmed by the documents. It's confirmed by their strategy. It's confirmed by who they brought in to a degree. So part of the force was the sort of, it's like National Guard. Think of it as a police force, and they were equipped to prevent rallies in the country, right? To sort of prevent civilian rallies. And they were not quite ready for the military resistance that they've got from Ukrainian army.
yeah.
So the first 3 days, the strategy was, hey, we're going to get to Kiev, topple the government. That would be it, sort of Crimea style. Guess what?
And
yeah,
it's so when that happens, and Andre, you're breaking up just a little bit. I'm not sure if you're on a headset or if there's a way to get a little closer to something. That just, I think you're holding us all transfixed, but you are breaking up a little bit. But when that first happened, what is your thinking? I mean, obviously now you mentioned that 2014 was this real kind of this real catalyzing experience for Ukraine. Are you thinking to yourself, this is going to be over in 3 days, or are you thinking that this is going to become what we have seen over the last 18, 19 days?
So all the reports, and including U.S. intelligence, and probably including me as well. I'm like, holy shit, it's going to be very quick or relatively quick, right? So I think a lot of people miscalculated this.
Yeah.
And by the way, so Russian army is considered to be second most powerful army in the world after the United States. That was the expectations. The expectation. To a degree, it was not unreasonable, but like it was not unreasonable for me. Putin should have known better, right? So the resistance that they've got was like completely unexpected. His strategy did not work. Now, the first 3 days, they spared the civilians. They did not touch the civilians. Clearly, they had instructions not to, not to like touch civilians at all. Right? Now, after the first 3 days, when it became absolutely clear that their strategy did not work, their plan did not work, there is no way they can get Kiev. They did not get a single major city, not a single major city. 19 days in, they don't have a single major city in the country. So it's clear that they are losing, right? They're not. It's still super hard for Ukraine. They're killing a lot of civilians.
A lot of civilians. I mean, and I mean, I know that like we want to look away from this, but it is so disconcerting. Where I mean, the images that are coming out are so disturbing, and this isn't war. These are civilian targets being deliberately targeted.
Exactly.
And
yes.
I mean, there's just no other. And I mean, at some point, I mean, clearly, I mean, Jesus, hearts and minds. Clearly, at some point, they're like, oh well, you know what? Fuck it. We're actually not going to. We want to take everyone that is potentially on the edge of this conflict and turn them into an enemy. I mean, I've just got to believe that there are plenty of people inside of Ukraine who are like, I don't know, and especially, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you've obviously got a lot of connections over there. And maybe after 2014 this wasn't true, but it's like anybody who had any sort of ambiguity about this, that ambiguity was extinguished once they started actually turning their arms on civilians.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So 3 days in, they've changed this, right? They said, "Fuck it, go after the civilians." So it was. By the way, how's my sound?
It's better. I think it's better.
Okay, good. I'm just trying to stay closer to my phone. Yeah. So they clearly changed the strategy, and they're trying. Yeah, again, as I said, not a single city was taken. Now, I started to learn about like military strategy and tactics as part of this. By no stretch of imagination, like I am an expert in all this. But essentially what's happening in the country, and it's still it's going to be super hard for Ukraine. A lot of people are going to die, still going to die. But because he couldn't do anything in 3 days, and he still cannot do anything, in 19 days, he's going to try very hard one more time. So there's this push that is coming within days. And we'll see what's going to happen. But at this point, I think Putin lost. In Ukraine, even if Zelensky, so by the way, Zelensky is an amazing leader. A lot of people did not like him. He is, I think he's one of the best leaders. Some people compare him to Churchill at this point. He's leading this resistance, and he and his government, everything, communication, how he talks to his own people, how he talks to the world leaders, and so forth, and all this exceptionally well-organized resistance is just incredible.
It's been extraordinary. I mean, honestly, just the level of courage, personal courage, and the refusal to evacuate, and it's as an outsider, it's just it's stirring. It's amazing.
Well,
Yeah.
and especially as a political novice, relatively speaking.
He is.
Yeah, right.
Yes, absolutely. He was playing in movies.
Yeah, I know.
He was playing the president, actually.
I'll take that. Give me that.
Yeah. So I guess all that training was pretty good, I guess. But he's exceptional. He's truly exceptional. And I think we're fortunate to have a president like this. So anyway, by the way, one thing that I wanted to mention, one of the reasons that I did not believe that Russia is going to attack, even though Biden and sort of the administration here was yelling and screaming everywhere that this is coming. The reason that I did not believe this is because they were screaming and they were doing exactly nothing.
Yeah,
Zero.
interesting.
They were just screaming. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like, is this a political thing? Like, why? Like, they probably benefit from this. It's like, hey, don't look at the economy. Look here, Ukraine-Russia war, right? So it looked like that. And they could have done things. They could have started with sanctions before the war. They could have done things to prevent the war, yet they elected to scream about it and do nothing. So back to the war and what's going on. So they've changed the strategy. They started to target civilians. They're trying to sort of unite their forces on sort of multiple fronts, and this is why Mariupol is so critical to them. But they also kind of trying to make a point, and it's a psychology warfare as well. They're trying to scare people. And one way to scare people is to do the shit that they're doing in Mariupol, that they did in Grozny, in Chechnya, that they did in what was the city called in Syria? Aleppo.
In Aleppo. Yeah, in Aleppo.
Aleppo. Yeah. It's the same strategy the Russians are using. They're killing the civilians. They're bombing the shit out of that city. That city pretty much doesn't exist anymore. And they would not allow civilians out, and they would not allow water, food, and medicine in.
Oh my God! And I mean, obviously, your parents are still in the thick of it in Dnipro. I mean, you must be worried sick about not just for the country, but clearly personally.
Yeah, we're all worried now. Dnipro right now being in the middle of the country. So far, there was no fighting in there. There were a couple of explosions. So the first day they blew up the airport, and then a couple of days back they blew up. It's not clear what they even targeted. It's just some factory, which is not related to anything. But the city was largely spared so far. There is food. It's functioning, right? There is food. There is like stores are open, businesses are somewhat working, and it's ready. It's ready for war, but it was spared so far. Now the fighting is happening like 40 miles away from the city, like 40, 60 miles. It's not far from it. But so far it was spared. I hope it's going to stay this way. We cannot move our parents out. They're too old. Right. It's hard. It's like people are making this, to get to the border, it's like 4 days of travel. It's very treacherous. It's not clear whether you can get gasoline along the way. There's literally no space to there are no hotels, no nothing, right? You can't even take a break. It's very hard on older folks. So
I mean, I feel it's like, you just think about, assuming that, your parents are the same, same age as roughly, my parents are at our parents are at an age where it's like basic stuff can be a challenge, let alone fleeing a war zone across a vast and war-torn country. I mean, it's like, oh my God.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, there are no bridges, pretty much. It's just it's difficult. It's difficult to make that trip. It's difficult for young people, and it's close to impossible for older folks.
Andre, are you able to communicate with them?
So what's interesting about this war is that all the communication is pretty much spared. And the reason, I think, is that Russians need this communication to work as much as Ukrainians. They actually, it sounds very ridiculous, but they don't have their own sort of military communication systems. They've invested a lot of money in their satellite communication stuff, and yet it doesn't work. Well, this is typical for Russia, right? So all the money got stolen, and shit was presented, but it doesn't really work. So they need it, and therefore it's being spared. Now, the way that it functions actually is on the areas that are under Russian control. It's our telecommunication companies, Ukrainian telecommunication companies. So they keep the connections going, but they reduce it to like 2G or whatever the speeds are. And this way, Russians, their encrypted communications that they have that rely on cellular networks, they don't work because it's too low bandwidth.
That's really interesting.
But it does allow for people to chat. It does allow to sort of send, images and so forth, and some videos. So the networks are spared, and this connectivity pretty much across the entire country, with some exceptions.
And I got to ask, how are your kids? How do they feel about this? They must be, I mean, extremely upset. Are they? Where do they land on all this? Just thinking about my own teenagers.
Yeah, so my kids are 16 and 18. My son, who's 16, he doesn't understand. Like, he listens to whatever is going on with us. He sort of gets it, sort of doesn't. And I remember myself when I was 16, like,
Right.
I wouldn't have a care in the world.
I mean, Andre, you were the guy that heralded the end of the Cold War by watching Hollywood videos. So, I mean, you got to understand that a little bit, I guess, that perspective.
Yeah, yeah. My daughter understands a lot, so she's 18. And what actually hits her hard is, more than anything else, is looking at us and how we react. And therefore, I'm trying to stay like super strong, super positive. It's harder for my wife to sort of keep composure at times, and that's what's hitting her hard.
Yeah, right. So in terms of, I mean, and obviously the kind of getting finally an hour and 9 minutes in, getting to the headline of the space, but I do want to talk about like how we in tech can help in Ukraine. Because Andre, you had a bunch of good ideas for the CTO group on concrete things that people can do to help.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Guys, I think what's going on with Russia right now is that it's being sanctioned. It's the most sanctioned country in the world at this point. Companies are leaving in droves. It's like everyone is stopping doing business with Russia. And at first, there was a lot of effort to get companies to get there sooner and accelerate the momentum. I think at this.
We lost you for a second.
Yes, it shows it. Okay. I lost my Wi-Fi.
Oh, that's actually much better. It sounds much better though.
Okay, hold on. Something was happening with my Wi-Fi. Okay, I'm gonna stay there. It showed 5G, so I'm gonna stay there. All right. So so a lot of companies as Russia or stop doing business with them. So it's still gonna help is official statement of support. More is the Personally and on the company level, donations really help. It has their efforts. Uh, it you could donate to the army. Now it's not going to be tax deductible, but there are places available where you could do directly that, or there are a number of not-for-profit organizations where it is tax deductible, where it's mostly humanitarian efforts.
Hey, Andre, I
Yeah.
apologize for interrupting. You're getting compressed or artifact or something, and I checked earlier. It was just on the speaker call, but I just checked the recording, and you're really cutting in and out. I don't know if there's anything you can do on your
All
end.
right, let me see. I'm going to try to do Wi-Fi again. Give me a second.
Sure. Sorry about that. Sorry, folks.
It's such an embarrassment. I mean, it's like no one's fault. Like I get it. Like it's super complicated. You got a lot of different software stacks.
Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yeah, it seems better. Yeah, I know. Brian, especially like when this happens in San Francisco, you're like, this isn't this supposed to the city's supposed to be good at tech?
Yeah, right, exactly.
When I moved to Silicon Valley from New Jersey, I was surprised how bad the cellular networks were.
The irony is that you really broke up while describing how bad it is.
When I moved to Silicon Valley, ...
Right, garble.
I'm sorry, guys. It looks like both. It looks like I have some sort of Wi-Fi problem, and cellular network problem. Can you still hear me, or?
Yeah, we can.
Seems better. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's hope it holds for a few more minutes. But bottom line, please donate. Please. Every dollar helps. There's a lot of humanitarian efforts that are going on. It's people are struggling. It's really bad in there.
Andre, where do you recommend donations going? Like what in your research it seems to be the most effective?
Yeah, so there are a lot of organizations that are working on the ground, but there are organizations that are directly Ukraine specific. So one organization that I recommend in particular, it is not-for-profit here in California, in Silicon Valley. It's called Nova Ukraine, N like Nancy, O, V as in Victor, A, novaukraine.org. This is, that your money is directly applied to Ukraine humanitarian efforts if you donate there. And then last thing that I want to say, please support first, if you have any Ukrainian engineers working with you, please support them. If they elect to defend the country, please support them. Please continue to pay salaries to them. It's important. And on the other hand, please support Ukrainian businesses. It's very important to keep the economy going. And I know that people are super dedicated. I know that people are working from bomb shelters in like Ukraine and in Kiev and Kharkiv. People are delivering on their deadlines and their commitments. So this would be the summary. Now, again, if you have an opportunity to make any effect on politicians, please do. Given the atrocities that is happening, I am of a mindset that United States and NATO should enter and stop it. It's inappropriate. It shouldn't happen in 2022 in Europe specifically.
It shouldn't. It is so, again, and watching these apartment buildings being targeted, or hospitals and maternity wards, and I feel like there's, and I'm glad you asked about like the specific nonprofit to support, because we all know that information is a weapon that's being used in this conflict. And Andre, you must have been aghast at some of the, and you would call it ham-handed propaganda, but accusing these photos of these women from a bombed maternity ward as being actresses. Which is just it's so shocking. I think you begin to feel, and obviously we've seen this in other conflicts where civilians become targets and then, powers deny it. But I feel like more viscerally with Ukraine, you do feel what it was like in 1939 and 1940. I mean, it where people are choosing to willfully turn a blind eye to something that is obviously happening in front of them. And I'm glad you asked, Adam, about the nonprofit, because with so much disinformation and misinformation out there, it can be hard to know, like, okay, wait a minute, I want to make sure that I want to make a difference, and I want to make sure that it's going somewhere where it's going to make a real impact. And Andre, have you talked to other folks that have had Ukrainian teams? Because I feel like, honestly, I mean, a bit of an elephant in the room is I feel that Ukraine has always been viewed as a way to save a lot of money for companies. Mm-hmm. And I kind of feel like, hey, if you're a company that has been getting great bang for the buck by Ukraine has really benefited your company and your software development organization. I think it's kind of time for you to pay some of that back. And Andre, you were saying one concrete thing that folks can do is continue to pay salary to Ukrainian engineers. And I certainly hope that companies are continuing to do that.
Yeah, Brian, I'm not sure if it's me or you, but I'm losing you time to time. So hopefully I'm coming across clear right now. You're absolutely right, and this is one of my huge requests, especially the folks that are defending their land right now. If you worked with them, please continue to support them. This would mean a lot to them, a lot.
Yeah. And so, Andre, how is your team faring? I mean, clearly some evacuated, and clearly some are staying. I mean, how are they doing?
So, People AI in particular, the bulk of the team was evacuated outside of the country prior to the war. So that was executed pretty well, I would say, and the company continues to operate without any interruptions or anything like that. We do support our folks that are in Ukraine right now. One of our engineers actually he joined it's called the territorial defense, and he's fighting for his country, and the company is supporting him. We have a fundraiser, actually, and you need to find it on somewhere on People AI site, where we are actually raising money to support him and his unit directly. But obviously, we continue to pay his salary and so forth. The rest of the folks who are still in the country, as I said, they got to safer parts of the country, and they continue to work. This is what
oh my God,
this is what people do. Yes, it's war, but the economy needs to continue to be healthy, right? And the economy needs to continue to work no matter what. So, obviously we don't, for people who are still in Ukraine, like there are no demands for them to deliver anything. Like they could take time off, they could do whatever. Nobody's forcing them to work. But they do because I think to a degree it's helpful to them. It's a degree of normalcy. But also what's important is, and it's supporting life as usual, and getting the economy going is like incredibly important. So I'll give you another example from a different company. So it's a women-led company. Actually, most of them are I think 36 people there. Most of them are women. It's a recruiting company. Actually, pretty good recruiting company. They were recruiting all around the world prior to the war. Most of them relocated out of where they were. So it's people in Kharkiv, people in Kiev. At first, they were, again, working from bomb shelters. Then they sort of took their kids and they fled into the western part of the country and into the Europe. And 70% of their business is gone. And I am helping them right now to sort of reestablish and find more customers. And they're working. They're not slacking around. They're not crying. They just continue the work, and it's extremely important to continue to do that.
Yeah, and continuing to support Ukrainian businesses, absolutely.
Yes,
and they're still Ukraine based.
They're still Ukraine based, right? They relocated to different cities. They're still Ukraine based. They're still paying taxes in Ukraine, and the second that it's safe to move back, they will.
Yeah, wow. Well, and just you were saying about like you got your team in Ukraine that's still like working, still like filing, still fixing Giro tickets, and just the need for normalcy. It reminds me of that. I remember the Onion headline after 9/11. There was that kind of, the Onion went dark after several days after 9/11, and then they had the headline, "Nation longs to care about stupid bullshit again."
Absolutely.
which I always like, and I mean, like, sometimes the stupid bullshit can be very, it's normalcy, as you say, Andre. So that, I think knowing that folks can help by supporting that normalcy and supporting Ukrainian businesses is really helpful. And Andre, in terms of, I just got to ask, what do you feel is the end game here in Ukraine? I think like everyone's kind of, as you say, Putin has effectively already certainly lost the hearts and minds. Where's this going?
Yeah,
nowhere good. Certainly.
I think it's on everyone's mind. What's the end game for Putin? So Putin needs to explain this to their, to their base at home, and he needs to show that he's won, right? Somehow, something, but that he has won. There needs to be a solution there. Now, from political standpoint in Ukraine, I don't think Zelensky is going to be able to do anything short of restoring the sort of regional borders of Ukraine, including Crimea, including all the, so-called republics, because so much has been lost. So many lives have been lost that I don't think people would forgive anything short of that. So that presents a challenge, and that needs to be negotiated. It's not clear to me how it's going to go, but clearly there's going to be more atrocities before that isn't negotiated. Now, can Putin take Ukraine? The answer is it's highly unlikely.
Yeah, the answer to me seems like clear. I just feels like obviously no, because you can occupy it for some period of time, but you're not going to be able to. That's not going to be persistent because this is a nation that is very clearly not going to be suppressed, is unwilling to not be independent.
Exactly. Yes, and it's guerrilla warfare. Supply lines are being attacked. There's no safe place in Ukraine for anything Russian.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yep.
Well, Andre, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to. Both your background and to learn the history, but also to explain what we can do. And obviously, just hoping that you and your family and your team and your country all stay safe during an incredibly dangerous time.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Adam, and thank you to everyone who was listening. I appreciate it, guys and gals.
Yeah, and we'll obviously, Adam, I saw you already dropped a link to Nova Ukraine. But that's a 501c3, so that's a great vector for those folks who are looking to push with dollars, but again, in tech, we've also got influence, and we can influence one another and influence people to treat their Ukrainian employees right. Influence folks to keep Ukrainian businesses alive. Andre, I thought that was a very good point. There's a lot of concrete things we can go do. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Andre, thank you especially, and hope everyone stays safe out there, and hoping for a peaceful resolution to this thing, and importantly, a peaceful resolution that includes an independent Ukraine, because this is a country that needs to stay free and independent. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.